Africa's aid organizations have been lauded for their humanitarian efforts in the Syrian conflict. The conflict began with the Arab Spring in 2011 and now has degraded into a civil war where there are many armed factions fighting for control. To give us some insight and to explain South Africa's humanitarian role in Syria is Afro Middle East Center Executive Director Naeem Jeenah. Thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
We'll talk about South Africa's humanitarian efforts, but I suppose let's start with a bit of a context. I mean, when this thing started, no one had any idea it would last so long, and 500,000, I think, lives have been lost in the process. What is at play here? What is at stake?
Well, I think what is at stake is for the various different parties that are involved, and this is an important point, and that is that Syria very quickly kind of degenerated into a situation where it stopped being about Syrians and it stopped being about, in many ways, legitimate demands that Syrian people were making on the streets. And it became about bigger geopolitical issues. It became about the Americans and the Russians and more regionally the Saudis and the Iranians and the Turks and the Qataris, etc. And this is the problem, that it's not just about the people of Syria and versus the government of Syria, if you like, or the people of Syria, including the government of Syria, but it's all these other agendas that come into play. So the most recent ceasefire, for example, was negotiated by the Russians and the Turks. The Syrian government wasn't even involved in it, nor was the opposition. So this, I think, is one of the big problems, is all the other external agendas. And for all these other parties that I've mentioned, Syria is important for different reasons for different ones of them. And that complicates it.
Russia, what's in it for them?
Well, for Russia, one thing is Syria has been, since the Soviet era, has been a Russian ally, or Soviet ally at that time. Russia has in Syria a naval repair base, which has the potential to be upgraded to a full-scale naval base. But the point about that is that it's only naval base in the Mediterranean. So this makes particular sense in winter months. If Russia has its ships out in the Mediterranean and something goes wrong, they don't have to. They can't go up to Russian waters, so they can repair them there. But apart from that, I mean, they've now built airfield, etc. Apart from that, in terms of geopolitics, Syria represents for Russia its westwardmost point of its sphere of influence. NATO is coming very close to Russia with Ukraine, Georgia, and all of that. So Syria is still, if Syria falls from a Russian perspective, falls to American influence, the American border or the western border becomes much closer to Russia. So it's very important from various perspectives.
So as you mentioned, Russia and Turkey signed this peace, ceasefire, whatever you want to call it. What does it help if the issue actually is about Syrians and it's happening inside Syria?
Well, the point is that many of these outside forces, they don't act on their own. They act in league with Syrian players or with players within Syria.
The rebels with the state.
So the Russians can come to the table with the Turks, make a deal, and then impose the deal on the Assad regime. The Turks can come to the table, make a deal, and then impose that deal on rebel groups that they are supporting. Obviously, they don't support all the rebel groups, so those that are supported by the Saudis might be unhappy about the deal. The Islamic State group, of course, is not part of it, etc. But they're able to bring, in a sense, their proxies together.
So how did South African aid organizations end up in Syria assisting?
Well, I mean, it's not a new thing.
Yeah.
Gift of the Givers was there from, I think, around 2012. They have a hospital in Syria. Other organizations, Al-Imdad has virtually a whole refugee camp in Jordan, on the Jordanian side of the Jordan-Syria border. That's been there for 2 or 3 years already. So there's been lots of work that's been going on. Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, not a South African organization, of course, it's a global organization, but the South African component has been playing an important role in Syria. So there's been a South African humanitarian role for a long time. It's not been very highly publicized. I think that the recent effort kind of got lots of publicity very suddenly. But that's been going on for a while in various kinds of ways. And not just kind of sending food and drugs, but real sustainable stuff, refugee camp or hospital, etc.
Right. Will this conflict come to an end?
Well, that depends on what an end means, what you mean by end.
Yeah.
But the way I see it playing out, I mean, you're now at a situation, the Russians are planning to have a conference probably by the end of this month, hosted between them, Turkey and Iran. They'll kind of bring in the Americans as, in a sense, now junior partners, really. They are betting that after Trump takes power on the 20th of January in the United States, that he'll basically go along with whatever the Russians say. The Russian plan, and has been their plan from 2015 when they got directly militarily involved, is to substantially weaken the opposition, the rebel groups, and then, which is where they are now, and then drag them to the negotiating table and impose a solution. So what you'll have, I think, is a negotiated deal worked out, and all of these parties will impose on their proxies in the situation. Deal worked out. Bashar al-Assad will remain in power for the next few years until the next election. There'll be a so-called government of national unity.
We're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. But when I hear weaken the opposition, this is what they did with Boko Haram, and they have just resurged much later. But we're going to have to leave it there, Naeem. Thank you very much for giving us your insights today. Take care.
Thanks.
All right, that was Naeem Jeenah talking to us about the situation in Syria. But what we